Everyone. Hi everyone, welcome to the weekly ISR and CPA seminar on Resilient Pacific. I'm very happy today to introduce our two speakers, Supin Wongburasurakum, sorry if I didn't get that totally correct, Supin, and Matt Gorstein. Before I fully introduce them, I just wanted to do two housekeeping reminders. The first is that this session is being recorded, which also means that it's available afterwards on CPAS's YouTube channel, as well as on ISR's webpage. The second is to please put your questions for Supin and Matt into the Q&A function. So don't use the chat, focus on the Q&A, and that way we can sort through them a little bit in one place. Supin is a coastal fisheries social scientist with the Pacific Island Community, SPC, and is an affiliated researcher with UHC grant. She's committed to improving human well-being while achieving environmental objectives and ensuring that social safeguards are integrated into all types of resource management. So welcome, Supin. Matt is a coastal economic specialist with the South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium. As an extension economist, he works with teams of applied researchers to conduct projects aimed at investigating the complex relationships between humans and the marine and coastal environment. Welcome, Matt. With that, I'll turn it over to both of you. Looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, McKenna. So our talk is titled Social Depth, Understanding Adaptive Capacity in Micronesia's Fishing Communities. Matt, are you moving the slide? Yes, thank you. So this is an almost 3-year project where we started with consulting the stakeholders to identify site, to understand what the climate issues are. And there are multiple people that have contributed to this work. Matt and I are presenting the work that is actually being supported and contributed by numerous people. You see here the picture of our core team. They are scientists in both natural, physical sciences and social sciences. And I would like to especially thank the community members, the fishers that have participated in this project, as well as a lot of peer researchers in many different fields. And of course, all the local organizations that support our work, our field research, help provide logistics. And lastly, the grant that comes from Southern Star Kennedy. Thank you. So I work for SPC, the Pacific Community, and McKenna, don't feel bad about pronouncing my last name. People say it usually takes 5 years. My name is Supin Wongburasurakum, and I'm social scientist with SPC, which is an intergovernmental organization. SPC was established in 1974, and it is owned by 26 members of the Pacific Island region. We cover over 20 sectors and areas of expertise, providing services in science, technology, law, policy, technical assistance, capacity building, to support and generate knowledge that benefit the Pacific Island people so that we can address effectively climate change, disaster risk, as well as strengthen the sustainable management of natural resources.
And I'm Matt Gorstein. I'm with the South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium. Really happy to be here today. What we do at South Carolina Sea Grant, so we are set up as a state agency and also a consortium of member institutions within the state. So we work with universities in South Carolina to conduct localized and regional applied coastal science projects aimed at getting the best available science in the hands of decision makers in coastal communities to foster sustainable coastal development and a healthy coastal ecosystems. You see our 5 focus areas that our work is centered on here: healthy coastal ecosystems, sustainable development and economy, weather and climate resilience, sustainable fisheries and aquaculture, and then also scientific literacy and workforce development.
For today's talk, we are going to cover several topics. I'm going to introduce the 4 sites in this project and their climate issues, talk briefly about our sampling design and the data collecting methods. I'm going to cover the indicators that we use to explore social adaptive capacity of the fishing communities, and the main chunk of this talk will be on findings of the different capacity categories. And lastly, we are going to summarize by discussing challenges and opportunities that could be useful for policy implication. So there are 4 sites in this study. The first site is West Planet, which is located in Yap, an island in the Federated States of Micronesia. And then we have 2 sites in Guam, in the south of Guam, Mariso and Umatak. And the last site is Pelen, which is in Pohnpei, also in FSM. These 4 sites were recommended by our local partner as most suitable for this proposed project for the following reasons. 1, they are all active fishing communities. 2, fishery issues and climate impacts are pertinent to each of the sites. They are also good representative of the islands on which they are located. Social scientific data collecting methods are feasible, and social ecological analysis and lesson generated can help inform fishery management and climate adaptation, both locally as well as regionally. So now let's take a look at the climate related issues. This is a summary of what we gather from the input from both survey, fishing household surveys, as well as from focus group discussions and interview with multiple informants. And you can see here that the 4 sites have common issues when it comes to climate events or impacts. The most important one are related to the increasing intensity of typhoon, coastal erosion, sea level rise, coral bleaching, landslide, flood, mud. Ocean acidification is also mentioned as one of the most important impact. And then there are certain events such as drought, high tide, and saltwater intrusion that are specifically mentioned in particular for certain sites. So we look at the scientific data to see, how close, how different these observations or experiences of the people at the sites are. And it is very similar in all events that what people notice are also confirmed by the scientific information. We can see here, this is a figure showing the track of strong storms that have been tracked for many years. And you can see that the site that we have, whether it's Guam, Yap, Pohnpei, they are all experiencing this increasing strong storm. Pohnpei might be a little bit out, but definitely Guam is right in the middle. We also take a look at sea level rise, current, and the projection. The global average sea level has accelerated. It has been about 3.2 millimeter per year since 1993. And the projection based on 2 scenarios. So you see the 2 different color. They are just 2 different climate scenarios based on global emission of greenhouse gases. And they both show similar pattern for Yap, Pohnpei, and Guam. It's going to reach between 25 and 30 centimeter by 2050 and about 60 to 80 by 2100. So if we look at sea surface temperature and the degree heat week that impact the reef, coral bleaching, we see that also the same trend, Yap, Pohnpei, and Guam show similar sea surface temperature and upward trend, can see clearly here. The degree heating weeks also show that these 3 islands were affected by a widespread bleaching and mortality event in the past few years. And they are projected to experience severe bleaching annually by year 2036, which is not too far ahead in the future. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the sampling and the methods of data collection in the field. We see here pictures that I took from the field as we were conducting focus group discussions with male, female fishers. You also see some of the team, core team in the field that help us collect fishing household data through using a questionnaire. So I'm grateful to have, many people that help us to be able to collect these data. We use primarily 3 data collecting methods. Next slide, please. As you can see here, we summarize the fishing household survey is actually census. So the coordinator helps us identify all the fishing household at each site. Sometimes it might look small in number, but please understand that for certain sites, sometimes one household actually provide the fish or the marine life that they harvest to a big number of households. So these are active fishing households. So we have 262 for all the household surveys in 4 sites. We have multiple focus groups, generally 2, one with men, one with women at each site. We have 45 participants, and we interview multiple people. They are community leaders, fisheries managers, people who work on climate adaptation, development of strategy, as well as key fisher of the community. Next slide, please. In terms of indicator area for social adaptive capacity, there have been a lot of literature, framework, indicator sets, and I was amazed because 2 weeks ago I had a chance to work on a project where I would have to update the resilience indicator that some of them are related to social adaptive capacity. There are many of them, and I'm listing some of them here so that you see the examples. We identify indicator in this study as locally relevant factors or variables. They need to be practical, valid, and reliable so that we can establish not only baseline, but also to continue to monitor the changes. For us, in this study, the social adaptive capacity is defined as ability of individual or a community to cope with, prepare for, and adapt to disturbances and uncertainties, both in the social and ecological conditions. Because social adaptive capacity encompasses a very wide range of factors, so for us, we find that it is more meaningful when we contextualize at a site-specific scales and engage local institutions and community to help us define which are the most important. And of course, some aspects of social adaptive capacity cannot be measured directly. And this creates a challenge when we have to try to find what type of proxy indicator or indirect indicator should be developed as they are necessary. So in designing the survey questionnaire for this project, next slide, please. We use one main framework. It's from Whitney et al. The paper is written in 2017. And we use this framework because it encompasses many areas that are relevant to the sites that we did the study. These include diversity and flexibility, which really are opportunities and options for people to adapt. Access to all types of assets. This includes natural assets, financial, technological, human, social, institutional, and all types of services. Learning and knowledge, which is capacity to access and learn new information about climate change, adaptation options, and way to live with or manage uncertainty. Then we have another area called governance and institution, which are ways that policy are developed and implemented to enable collective action to address environmental as well as climate issues. So Whitney had these 4 primary areas of social adaptive capacity summarized in her framework. And while we were conducting actually the study already, there was another paper from Sinner that came out that talked about social adaptive capacity. One of the main areas in his paper talked about agency, which is the ability of people individually or collectively to have free choice in responding to environmental change. So we include agency as well in our framework, but agency was examined primarily through qualitative data. Next, please. So now we are going to talk about key findings, and Matt is going to walk us through the findings for the first social adaptive capacity, which is diversity and flexibility.
Thank you, Supin. So starting with the key findings for this first category of diversity and flexibility. So as we go through each of these categories of social adaptive capacity, we'll start each section with some relevant quotes from the Fisher focus groups. So a couple things that came up relevant in the focus groups. People are fishing further and deeper. There are now more women fishing now more than in the past. So this points to changing roles and changing techniques and changing focus areas in terms of where people are fishing and who is doing the fishing. Someone else mentioned, even though we have seen a drastic decline in fish population, it's really hard for us to just stop fishing. So we have to find a balance somewhere, which is why the word sustainability is very important. We are to use it, but in a sense that it still sustains itself. So this gets at the sense of sustainability and wanting to be flexible and diverse in your practices so that resources aren't overused and start to deteriorate. So going through some descriptive statistics here, some frequencies for diversity and flexibility. So not surprisingly, fishing remains the most important form of livelihood and remains an important subsistence activity according to survey respondents in these areas. The majority of people use multiple types of fishing methods and gear types. So this points to a high level of diversity in terms of methods and gear. All of those who do fish do so for subsistence purposes, at the very least, to feed themselves or their family. And then when we're talking about gear types, we're talking about hand lines, nets, spearing, trolling, those sorts of things. We also asked respondents, we posed them a series of Likert-style agreement statements. So agreement levels for statements related to diversity and flexibility are shown here, some selected statements. For statements in which we observed large differences across the sites, the site level data are shown. So these statements 1 and 3, we just showed the all sites average because they were pretty similar in nature. And then we pointed out some differences at the site level for these statements 2 and 4 here. So overall, we see high levels of self-reported diversity and flexibility, with the majority of respondents from each site agreeing with these select statements. People are able to change fishing methods. They're able to change fishing sites, although it should be noted that this is not possible or not as possible for people in Yap in the West Finif study site due to the practice of traditional sea tenure. So we see a smaller level of agreement in Yap with the ability for their household to move different fishing sites, and this is due to a more strict control over who can fish where. And most households are willing to do things differently to adapt. Most use traditional practices, especially in Marizo, where we see over 90% of Marizo households say that they use traditional practices to help adapt to a changing climate. So a brief summary on this diversity and flexibility section. So people exhibit diverse livelihoods, but fishing still is the most important. 100% of fishers fish to feed their family, 99% fish for special occasions, 92% fish for fun, 90% fish to give away, and 60% fish to sell. So a multitude of reasons people are fishing for. People are willing to change sites and methods. They've learned to adapt from their experiences with natural disasters. Coral reefs continue to be a trusted resource for income and livelihood. And the majority of people are willing to stop fishing for a different way of living that's more secure, but alternative options to generate cash remain few. And now I'll pass it back to Supin for a discussion on access to assets.
Thank you, Matt. So in terms of access to assets, as I mentioned, there are multiple types of assets. Here we look at what people say, what level they can access these different items. And you can see here from the table that the level of access to these items are pretty high. They definitely can access the social assets, support from relatives and friends. People report that they can access to knowledge and skills they need. Land and sea resources are accessible. materials for livelihood as well. The one that have lower degree of accessibility seem to be funding if they need for any kind of livelihood development. The lowest one, as we see here, are actually access to support from government or leaders. Next slide, please. So 83% in the survey feel that they have access to land and sea, that they can use for both subsistence as well as to generate income. But through the study, we also look at the ecological and biological condition, and we realize that fish and marine resources are declining in size, in number, and variety. As one of the quote of the people, of the fishers say, now it's different. You get what you get. And it's often not the same stuff, or it's not the right size. One of the fishers say, casually fishing nowadays like fishing in the desert. But these things reflect that when the fisher have alternative livelihood, it's still natural resource based. But unfortunately, the degradation of the resources that are dependent on make us realize that this kind of adaptation to be based on nature or natural resource locally is actually quite vulnerable. We take a look, there are different sets of biological data, but here's one. This one is showing the mean biomass of Umataq, and you see two green lines. The dotted one is from 2017, and the solid one is 2014. And you can see here that it's actually showing that the biomass of these are favorite food fish. They have become quite low in comparison. If you look at the different bar, the light color one show the area where there are fewer people, and the darker one, the area where there are more people. But you can see here that the biological data show us that the biomass in Umataq is actually lower than some of the area that have really high population density. So this is definitely of concern, because similar data is also shown in other sites, and we in the survey asked for perception data, and both in terms of current condition and how things have changed. Most people talk about the condition of the marine resources as being poor or have been declining. Next slide, please. So one thing that is really heartwarming, and this is consistent in all sites, is that all sites still maintain very strong social networks. So social assets is one of the most important things that I could see consistently across all sites. And I think this is one characteristic in the Pacific Island country as well, that when people don't have livelihood, when they are facing disaster, it's always a social network that help them, support them. And you can see the percentages here, that both household members as well as friend and family and other community members are what people can rely on. Next slide, please. So we asked some likelihood statements to see what people say, and definitely this is to confirm again that household has access to land and sea resources. They can use it for subsistence, for generating income. Again, the message about social network. My household has friends, relatives, and other community groups who support us through difficult times. In terms of support from leadership, this vary a lot. Average, it looks like it's a little bit above the middle level, 60, but when you look through the different sites, there's a wide variety from 37% up to 92%. So leadership is definitely very different from site to site. So summary on access to assets. Generally, people can access the natural resources, and they have very strong social network they can rely on. Unfortunately, the natural resource base has deteriorated in condition. Financial assets and governmental support is something that can definitely be improved. The next social adaptive capacity we are going to look at is related to learning and knowledge. And these are capacity to access and learn new information about climate, adaptation option, and way to live and manage uncertainty. Traditional knowledge and practices, it's still rated quite high to help the community to successfully cope with climate event. We put 2 stars here because we noticed when we analyzed the different groups who answered this question, that there's actually a significant difference between men and women. We asked the question whether traditional knowledge helped cope in the past. We also asked the question whether it helped cope the current condition. For the current condition, the percentage dropped from 74, which was what people say it could help in the past, down to 54%. But when we look closely, there's a significance between women who gave this rating 73%. So it's almost the same as what they think traditional knowledge and practices could help in the past, while men only 51%. So every other people do not think that traditional knowledge and practices could help coping with climate events today. In the family, local and traditional knowledge for managing and sustaining fishery are still passed on from generation to generation. Household members have knowledge and skill to use local land and resources to support their family. This is rated very high. In terms of knowledge, in terms of awareness related to the causes and impact of climate change, the percentages vary a lot, with only 32% in Pohnpei, Thailand, in Guam. So there's discrepancy in terms of what people rate the community awareness related to climate change. All sites, this is similar to access to social assets. Even for learning and knowledge, people say most of the resources are through informal social network, like friends, family, other community members. If you look at the last two cells to the right, those are percentages where people say they get skills and knowledge from governmental training program or educational institution. And you can see that those are not very high in comparison to sources related to family or friends. Next slide, please. So to summarize learning and knowledge, people agree, the majority agree that they are willing to learn and do things differently to respond to climate impacts and hazards. There are also a lot of scientific information that people can use. When we talk with managers, when we talk with scientists, researchers, there seem to be a lot of information. But the problem when we talk to the focus group is it is not reaching. It is not accessible by the committees or the fishers themselves. So there's a disconnect clearly between scientific data and the usability or accessibility by the local stakeholder. We also found out when we were trying to see which group of these people that we conduct a survey with would need high level of knowledge and skill training. And we found out that fishers who fish daily indicate the need more than any other groups. Sharing of information skills still come from social network in our sites. And now I'm going to pass it on to Matt, who's going to talk about governance and institution.
Right, thank you, Subin. So yeah, now we'll touch on this fourth category of social adaptive capacity here, governance and institutions, and a couple focus group quotes to get us started off with. So one person mentioned that there's no real leadership in terms of climate change adaptation, that adaptation to climate change is often not as prioritized amongst an array of other issues, and that there's the next person mentioned residents recognize a need to have planned, thoughtful, robust fisheries management, but it takes political will and resources to accomplish. So this is a need that is known, but there seems to be a lack of resources and a lack of impetus amongst the people that can make these decisions to actually make some concrete adaptation plans for climate change. A couple other quotes: they can adapt and it has to be. You must find a good champion in the community that can lead. So this actually came up across a few sites, is the need for a conservation champion to make the cause visible and to be a connector of people and groups. Communities need to be a part of the solution that involves resource agencies and policymakers to really address the fisheries issue. So this has to do with localized grassroots buy-in and engagement from the community that relies on the fishery in terms of managing it and protecting the resources within it, and so that the community is involved in co-creating solutions and co-implementing management options, so that they have a stake in the effort, they get benefit from the effort, and it's more tangible buy-in and engagement from that localized community level. So some frequencies here. So one thing to note with the governance and institutions is that across each of these sites, there's different forms of governance, there's different forms of management of marine resources. So we see more divergence and agreement across the sites than we did with previous examples, previous categories of social adaptive capacity, like diversity and learning. We also see somewhat lower levels of agreement with each of these statements that are related to governance and institutions, which perhaps suggests some room for improvement in this area of social adaptive capacity. So going through some of the results here, those in Pohnpei seem to have a more negative perception of fisheries management when compared to the other three sites. So only 15% of households in Penang agree that fisheries are managed sustainably. So this indicates that people in Penang may perceive that unsustainable fishing practices are taking place, or there could be a lack of compliance or a lack of enforcement. So then moving down the list, those in Umatak, they seem to be the most concerned that fisheries management is not taking climate change into account, whereas those in West Finif are most confident about fisheries management entities addressing climate change. Those in Penang also agree less that there is adequate cooperation for fisheries management in their community, which perhaps suggests an every man for himself type of mentality. So one area of improvement for each site would be the better inclusion of women into decisions about fisheries management. Although there seems to be more inclusion in Marizo, we see low levels of agreement, just about a third or under a third of households in each of these three sites that are non-Marizo sites agreed that women are included in decisions with fisheries management. We also asked some site-specific management option questions to assess support or opposition toward these management initiatives. So we found general support for natural resource management to be present in all of the villages. Looking here at in Penang and Pohnpei, more than half of the respondents highly support each proposed management options, and the mean scores indicate above average support for all management options. So if a mean score, if we see a score of 3, that would indicate about an average, but we see means all above 3. So more supportive than opposed to each of these management options in Pohnpei. Moving on to what we asked in Umatak, the main key takeaway here is that we still see general support for management, but the option with the most support is the one that proposes to give more control to the local community. So this is that third one down here, the proposed bill to give Umatak the authority to manage their coastal areas. We find that almost 80% of respondents in Umatak highly supported this option, and the average support on a 1 to 5 scale was about a 4.3. Lastly, with governance and institutions, something that also came up in focus group discussions with female fishers, women are an important part of the fisheries value chain. However, among the surveyed households, fewer than half agreed that women are included in fisheries-related decisions. And in some sites, less than 30% agreed that women are included in these decisions. So again, a potential area for improvement in governance and institutions and fisheries management in these study sites is further inclusion of women in these decisions that affect resources that everyone in the community is depending on. And now I'll pass it back to Supin for a discussion of agency.
Thank you. Agency we define here as ability of people, whether it's individually or collectively, to have free choice in responding to environmental change that might or might not be related to climate impact. We ask people, if you were not able to do your current job or livelihood, what would you do for your food and income? And as you can see from the percentages here, that people self-rate as being able to take action, if that is the situation, really high. The lowest is 77%. So people have the confidence that they have the ability to deal with this kind of situation. When we take a look closer at the type that they would do if their current job or livelihood is not there, you see here that people mention farming, fishing and farming, relying on the family, even betel nut. When in terms of fishing and farming, definitely that is natural resource based. So if you cannot fish, you farm. And if you cannot fish or farm, you rely on your family. But people do think that they have some ability to be able to adjust. We also ask people to think about two scenarios. One, what would happen if the seafood or fish that they are reliant on were cut in half? And what would happen if there's hardly anything left? And if you look at the percentages across all sites, still very high number of people would say they are able to take action, even that kind of situation. So we asked them, so what would you do? And if you can take a look here, the left column is when their fish and seafood are reduced by half, and the right one is when there's hardly anything left. And you see people are willing to adjust, reduce, stop fishing. They would be more reliant on terrestrial resources. Small number of people think they can buy store. People would change lifestyle and so on. But the interesting thing is percentage of people cannot think of anything is really low. Nothing is 2% in either scenario. Next, please. So
Okay,
now, yes,
yeah.
Go ahead.
I'll take over. So now so we've talked about the categories of social adaptive capacity, some of these Likert style agreement statements and how they relate to the categories. What we also did with this project is to calculate quantitative indices of the 4 social adaptive capacities according to the Whitney framework. So this is diversity and flexibility, access to assets, learning and knowledge, and governance and institutions. So the reason for generating and calculating these indices is to also do some inferential statistics with this data to see what is influencing each of these categories of social adaptive capacity. So firstly, in order to determine reliable groupings of these Likert agreement statements, we use the Cronbach's alpha statistic with a threshold of 0.7 or greater deemed to be a reliable grouping for the index. So the table here to the left shows how these statements grouped across the categories. It's probably hard to read, but don't worry about reading it here. Really, the take home here is that we group these statements in a way to where they produce reliable scales so that they can be generated into indices. And you see the Cronbach's alpha results here with each of these social adaptive capacity indices having a Cronbach's alpha statistic of greater than 0.7. So with the reliability of the scales confirmed, what we did was we generated, simple additive indices were calculated for each social adaptive capacity category based on the ordinal responses to the statements. So we asked people on their level of agreement with those statements, and then with corresponding to each of those answers, we gave a number value. So 1 for strongly disagree, all the way to 5 for strongly agree. So then these additive indices, so each of these statements, we coded them according 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The grouping within the diversity scale, we added those up to create a diversity index. These indices were then normalized to a 0 to 100 scale using the equation here. So this is the min-max scaling method, where x is the value of a given variable in a distribution, min is the minimum possible value of the distribution, max is the maximum possible value in the distribution, and x norm is the value of the given variable adjusted to a 0 to 100 scale. So the reason for doing this normalization and aggregation is that it's used to resolve the fact that each index, so the diversity index, the access index, the learning index, they're each comprised of a different number of statements. So while these don't necessarily have units, the normalization of the index provides a linear transformation that preserves the ranking structure of the ordinal data. And it also allows for variables with different number of statements with different scales to be summed and compared. So these 4 indices were then aggregated into a single index for social adaptive capacity with this equation, where each of the four categories of social adaptive capacity are weighted equally to generate a composite index of social adaptive capacity. So some descriptive statistics for these additive normalized social adaptive capacity indices are shown here. So a note on interpretation, an index value of 50 would represent a situation where the respondent answered neither agree nor disagree for each question within the given index. And each of these indices is going to increase as self-assessed social adaptive capacity increases. So the average composite social adaptive capacity index for the sample is estimated at 61.5, indicating that self-assessed social adaptive capacity is slightly above average, again, with the assumption that an index score of 50 would be average. All four of these indices, of the sub-indices, so the D, the A, the L, and the G, all four of these indices are correlated with one another. So this indicates that those who possess higher levels of social adaptive capacity in one category are also more likely to exhibit higher levels in other categories and vice versa. So we use these quantitative continuous indices to generate some OLS linear regression models for each index as dependent variables. Independent variables shown here in this column were chosen to examine what factors may help explain variance in social adaptive capacity indices. So what factors we looked at include type of livelihood, fishing frequency, reasons for fishing, gear use, coral reef dependence, impacts from human-driven and climate-driven hazards, and then also demographics as well. So the table here is going to show these results, and then these asterisks indicate different levels of statistical significant findings. So going through some of the findings, first off of the bat, a few sort of, I guess, intuitive conclusions emerge. So firstly, the number of household members who cannot read or write contributes negatively to social adaptive capacity in 3 out of the 5 models. Additionally, having been highly impacted by pollution contributes negatively to social adaptive capacity in 4 out of the 5 models. While having been highly impacted by erosion is significant and negative in the social adaptive capacity model, the only other model in which it is significant is governance institutions, which perhaps suggests that households impacted by erosion may feel that agencies responsible for erosion mitigation efforts have room for improvement. So moving on to some other findings, fishing to sell your catch contributes negatively to social adaptive capacity in 4 out of the 5 models, which suggests that those reliant on commercial fishing tend to exhibit lower levels of social adaptive capacity. We see that relying on tourism as a form of livelihood actually increases diversity and flexibility, as well as overall social adaptive capacity, suggesting that the tourism sector can be a relatively fruitful one. We also see that depending on coral reefs for income and or livelihood contributes positively to social adaptive capacity in 4 out of the 5 models. So while these households don't necessarily depend exclusively on coral reefs, rather most depend on multiple habitats, this finding suggests that those who know how to frequently obtain resources from coral reefs feel that their social adaptive capacity is maybe slightly higher than those who do not depend on coral reefs. Also, using spearfishing as a method contributes negatively to social adaptive capacity in 3 of the models. These spearfishers are commonly harvesting herbivorous fish that regulate algal growth on reefs. Without these fish to regulate algal growth, this further stresses these habitats. So this finding could suggest that those who spearfish may be aware of these impacts and may perceive this as an unsustainable practice. So now I also wanted to talk about some other interesting, maybe somewhat counterintuitive findings that emerged. So having been highly impacted by typhoons contributes positively to social adaptive capacity in 4 of the models. So, usually being highly impacted by typhoons would have diminishing effects on social adaptive capacity. However, there could be a couple possible explanations for this finding here. So those who are reporting having experience going through a typhoon have inherently had to deal with a situation in which their social adaptive capacity was challenged, and these households met that challenge and persisted on living their life. So the idea is perhaps having overcome a challenge like this can help them in the future should their social adaptive capacity be challenged again, thus leading to higher self-assessed levels of social adaptive capacity for these people that have been highly impacted by typhoons. Furthermore, the number of college-educated household members ended up contributing negatively to social adaptive capacity in all 5 of these models. So while we would usually think more education, would increase social adaptive capacity, when considering adaptive capacity to climate change, there may be a couple other possible factors at play. So it's understood that using traditional ecological knowledge and practices can increase the resilience of coastal communities in the face of climate change. So to try to unpack this finding a bit further, we used a correlation analysis to examine relationships between the number of college graduates in a household and their perceptions of traditional knowledge and practices and their agreement on their use. All of these findings actually showed a negative correlation between the number of college graduates in the household and agreement with statements related to traditional knowledge and practices. So what this suggests is that a lack of understanding and using traditional ecological knowledge may actually outweigh the benefits of formal educational attainment when it specifically comes to social adaptive capacity to climate change. So this result was, we further examined this in consultation with community experts, who also went on to explain that formal higher education does not necessarily equip people with a diverse range of place-based knowledge and skills that would prepare them to make use of local resources if they had to handle a difficult situation. They may not have gained or may have lost local knowledge assets that are useful for dealing with natural hazards and climate adaptation. So, what we think that a significant policy implication of this finding is that it's important to maintain local knowledge among the younger generations and to sustain not only formal education, but informal education as well, to ensure that useful place-based knowledge is accessible when needed. And so now I'll pass it back to Supin for a brief summary before we open up the floor.
Thank you so much, Matt. So just a couple more slides to summary the challenges and opportunity that we see. As you have heard, the finding, definitely people rate themselves to be highly flexibility, to be willing and willing to be diverse in their livelihood. But the issue is that in Micronesia, livelihood are primarily nature-based, and it depends on weather and climate a lot. Local resources may have suffice for subsistence activities, but alternative income generation is limited. A lot of time the cash income generation is linked to employment with the government, but other types of employments that can generate cash, the number is low. So likely we would require new infrastructure, knowledge, capital processes, and other type of support to diversify the type of livelihood that are not based on nature or natural resources. Policy, institution, processes are needed to strengthen this kind of livelihood development to reduce the vulnerability. Value adding in fisheries production, along with innovative livelihood diversification into less natural resource dependent or less climate sensitive options would be something that we would recommend. In terms of access to assets, as you have all heard, people are very strong in terms of social assets and social network, but natural resources that they are relying on is declining. It's in poor condition. So there is some need to help improve the natural resource condition and to capitalize on the strong social network. Learning and knowledge also come a lot from social network, and there has been a lot of confirmation that there is a lot of scientific information, but there's a disconnect in terms of their applicability on the ground with the fishers. Governance and institution varies a lot in our study, but definitely there's a need not only to have commitment from leadership to create champions that doesn't have to be somebody in the leading position, but someone who can lead such a climate adaptation and fisheries management effort. We also realize that women have to be included in decision making, and they are important in all steps of value change in fisheries. We also have learned that in all sides, community involvement in management has been highlighted and considered as an important part of the solution. For agency, I put in quotation mark here, highly self-rated. That's what the findings say. So the question is, how would we use the agency that people perceive in themselves and able to support them so that they can really be empowered in terms of decision-making as well as implementation of adaptation strategies. In terms of opportunities, as I mentioned before, promote income-generating options that are not dependent on natural resources and are sustainable. We talk about tourism being rated highly, but as you all witness, when something like COVID-19 happened or type of certain economic downturn or disaster happened in the countries, then tourism is relying on outside visitors, and it is not as strong as it might be for other type of local way of livelihoods that do not have to depend on outside economy or be affected by such a condition of disaster. Access, I mentioned already, to improve the natural resource conditions, maintaining and capitalizing the social assets. Have science that is accessible, communicate science in a way that people can make use and become tangible in their action. Leadership, increase community involvement in all ways, and have women mainstream in any type of decision making and implementation. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone here for your attention. It's a lot of material, and we actually developed a paper we have submitted recently. And once that paper is published, if you are interested, let us know. We are happy to share. Thank you.
Mahalo, Supin and Matt. That was really interesting. That was really great to hear about both your research process as well as the findings. Just a reminder to everybody that this is being recorded and that we ask that you put your questions into the Q&A. And while we wait for some audience questions to come in, I have a couple, so I'll start until we hear some. Oh, they're coming already. Good. Let me squeeze one in of my own. I was really interested. I think this was your portion of the talk, Matt, in terms of some of the statistics of what you found in fisheries management, taking into account climate change impacts into consideration. And there were sort of two aspects of it that caught my eye. One was that, in FANF, it was, very high level, saying that it was being incorporated. And then also in Guam, between Humatak and Mauricio, there was quite a divergence. I'm wondering if, in a more qualitative way, if you have examples of how people are incorporating climate change into practice there, and also what might be driving such large divergences, particularly, in the context of having similar governance, right, of a region.
Supin, did you glean anything from the focus group discussions related to that?
Yes, so in the field, when we talk about the high percentages, to understand what qualitative data say, people don't necessarily separate climate impacts from other type of impacts. And in terms of governance, it is interesting in the sense that, I'm talking about multiple sites now. For example, the site in Pelen, we see that the percentage is very low and there's a lot of doubt about governance. But also, I think this is linked to the fact that people in Pelen is known as the most important, I would say, village when it comes to fishing. So people are highly reliant on fishing. While people in Guam, they have multiple types of livelihood. And when it comes to impact of climate change on fisheries, the people in Pelen are probably mostly impacted among all sites. And for themselves, it's a mix of whether this is really climate and whether this is going to be something that people in the governance level can address, or is this something related to real problem with pollution or with fishery. It's not separated as such, but their own reliance is so high on fisheries. So I guess that's why their doubt, of how this can be successful is also higher, and that is reflected in the way they rate the sustainable way of managing. Why people in Guam, you know, even when they are reliant on fishing, but they have other types of livelihood that they can rely on, and therefore their own perception of how governance is working maybe not as being impacted negatively because their reliance is lower. Do I understand your question correctly, McKenna? Am I answering your question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That provides a lot of context. And I guess I was wondering if there were any specific examples, particularly relating to climate change impacts being incorporated.
I cannot answer right away. I would have to look. I would think there are, but cannot think of one right away. Yeah, I would have to look through the notes.
So Supin, is Ashang Preserve in Umatak as well as Marizo, or is that adjacent, involve Umatak as well as Marizo?
Yes, so that's one, but it's not really developed for climate adaptation. So there is a marine preserve in Marizo. That's what Matt mentioned, Achang. But it is created because of the desire of the local people to have an area where outsiders are not going to come in and fish. So the preserve is kind of developed in order to protect and make sure that it can reduce the illegal fishing by outsiders. It might have some impact in terms of, you know, climate resilience, but that wasn't an intention of it being established.
We've had a couple of great questions come in. I'm going to turn to the Q&A. Thank you for the really great talk. I was wondering if you asked for any additional information about the social networks, specifically the location of relative, family, friends that people rely on for support. Are they located in the same communities? And if so, might they also be struggling with similar challenges and less able to help? Or are they located abroad in other communities and thus less likely to be facing the same challenges? Along the same lines, I was wondering if/how remittances may impact social resilience in these locations.
Yes, thank you for asking that question. You are absolutely right. I'm not sure who asked the question, but in all the Pacific Island sites that we have in the study, remittances is one of the main livelihood. And of course, you know, these are people, a part of the family, relatives who are not physically in the same site, but they are helping to support in many different ways, including the financial needs of the family. So yes, it is correct that these people are from somewhere else. And it also, you know, create a concern that we have, for example, right now with COVID, you know, when remittances might not be coming in, or when people who are somewhere else abroad themselves lose their employment and ability to support the family at home, what would we do? It's a good question.
We did also ask about source of seafood, where people get their seafood beyond just catching it. And part of the what we asked was, you know, if you don't have fish, where does your backup come from? Does it come from stuff you have stored, or do you go to the store, or do you rely on people, friends and family in your village, or friends and family outside your village? So we did ask that question. I don't have the results off the top of my head, unfortunately. But that is a concept that we did try to address with the survey.
True.
We are almost to the hour, but let's squeeze in one last question, if that's okay. Looking back on your methodology and results, given this experience, if you were to replicate the study, are there any dynamics or domains that you would seek to engage with differently, or that you would add as additional factors to investigate towards understanding social adaptive capacity?
Good question. I'll go first, Matt. One thing that came out, and you know, when we developed the survey, we did not think about having disaggregated data or strongly focus on social inclusion or gender issues. But through the focus group and through the result that we got, some of the questions related to gender, we realized that this is actually a very important topic. And had we revised this methodology, I think I would actually put a gender lens into this whole study, and to understand, you know, the differences between men and women, and what we could do to make sure that women that we have information to support the policy in terms of including women in decision making in fisheries. When we started the study, you know, we were told, well, marine is the realm for men, and women are not really involved. But once we had a focus group and survey, it's like women are telling us, we do make decisions, we are being impacted, we want to do something. So that would be one thing that I would probably revise. Matt?
Yeah, for me, thank you, Supin. That's a great point. So I think, so as you saw at the end, we went through some inferential statistics related to 4 of the 5 categories that we discussed. So I think for me, a potential way to improve or at least our conceptual framing moving forward is to better address the concept of agency. So as Supin mentioned, when we were designing the survey questionnaire in our indicators and our target variables, we were doing it based on the Whitney framework. And then this other paper that talked about agency sort of came out in the middle of our research process. So we realized we had some data that can be used to address the agency concept as a proxy, but we didn't necessarily set out to collect data for it. So the data that we have aren't quite perfect for getting at that concept of agency. They're much more suitable for these other 4 categories. So I think, you know, going forward, it'd be nice to better think about incorporating agency in a more systematic way, so that we can analyze it quantitatively, you know, once we get data in.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Supin and Matt. That was a really interesting talk. It was great to learn much more about your research. And just a plug for next week, everyone. Seth Quintus from the UH Manoa Anthropology Department will be joining us talking about the deep time construction of Polynesian islands. So with that, we will sign off, and just a big mahalo for your talk and for being with us today. Bye, everyone.
You're welcome. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thanks. Mahalo.